Let's talk about Risk of Rain 2, which I know is a lot of people's favorite roguelite of the year. It didn't really click for me at first, but once it did, I had a lot of fun with it. Still, I do think there are some flaws, so let's get into it. Risk of Rain 2 is a third-person shooter roguelite, and the core gameplay involves you running around these different stages or maps, and defeating enemies as they spawn around you, and using cash you get from enemies to repair drones or collect items from chests. More about items later in the RNG section. Once you find the altar on each map, it ends with a boss fight and defend event, and then you go on to the next map. After 5 stages, you can fight a challenging final boss to end your run, or you can loop the game back to the beginning and fight through increasingly difficult levels forever or, as long as you want. The core gameplay loop is really fun with the enemy variety and the looting. In the gameplay itself, the skills and combat is just really smooth and responsive, which is a big selling point of the game for me. Outside of that, a lot of the fun for me came from trying out the 10 different characters or survivors that you can play as, and the game does a really good job of giving them different movesets, abilities, and playstyles. Some are some more standard range characters, some are melee, some have damage over time effects, and there's one that sacrifices health on abilities but heals when you do damage. So there really are a number of playstyles there, and you can customize the loadout or moveset of each character once you unlock alternative moves and abilities through completing challenges or secrets. Risk of Rain 2 is really a secret or challenge heavy game in a way, and I'll talk more about that later in the progression section. Another big draw of Risk of Rain 2 is the multiplayer. One of the reasons that I played this game as much as I did is because of this feature. And the core gameplay mixed with multiplayer reminds me a little bit of Left 4 Dead and some other zombie games, especially during the final boss fights where you have swarms of enemies around you and you're fighting them off at once. It just gives off that zombie game vibe to me. Risk of Rain 2 also has this interesting difficulty scaling mechanic where the longer you're on a run, the harder it gets. So the difficulty doesn't just scale based on what stage you're in, but if you're on one stage for a longer period of time, difficulty also goes up and it'll spawn harder enemies and more of them. This creates this interesting tension between looting and rushing. You want to find more items to be more powerful, but if you take too long to loot on a given stage, you might actually be weaker relatively speaking because the enemies get harder faster than you get stronger. I get the point of this mechanic, it's to reward speed and not create this slow, tedious looting in each area, but it also meant that if you take too long and the game scaled too much, you ended up with super upscaled enemies that turn into these really boring bullet sponges. Additionally, to go along with this, Risk of Rain has a lot of insta-kill potential, especially during boss fights or just as the difficulty scales. So it can be on a run, it can be going just fine. You activate the boss event or a certain enemy spawn, you just immediately die and your run is over, which can obviously be very frustrating and not very fun. And on that note, I have some other admittedly more minor annoyances with the game, so let's get into them. If you quit a game, you can't continue it later, so if something comes up, you can't save a run to complete it later, and the run just ends. And while you can pause the game in single player, there's no way to pause in multiplayer, and there are also no dedicated servers, which can cause some lag issues. Neither of these multiplayer problems are surprising, that's how a lot of smaller online games work, but they are minor annoyances. Also, one gameplay problem that I think might literally just be a me problem, I haven't heard of other people having this problem, is once or twice I couldn't find the altar or portal to the next stage, and occasionally it just took me a really long time to find that altar, especially when I was learning new areas when I first discovered him. Because the game difficulty scales up if you take too long, not being able to find the altar quickly basically tanked those runs and made me frustrated. Finally, in addition to having periods where you're absolutely getting swarmed with enemies, like during the boss events, there are also some weird dead periods where you're just waiting for enemies to spawn so you can get cash to open chests, usually at the beginning of stages, and these periods are just kind of boring at times. They're just not very exciting. But these minor annoyances are just that, minor, and the core gameplay loop is still incredibly fun despite these. I like to talk about randomness in RNG and roguelites because procedural generation is a core piece of the roguelite genre that should provide fresh gameplay, but sometimes provides frustration instead. So what does that look like in Risk of Rain 2? The main way that randomness affects your run is determining what items, drones, or turrets you get on a given run. Some items are just better than others, and some items also just mesh better with certain characters. So getting the right item can be really important and play a big role on a given run's success. Additionally, when you get certain items also matters. So for example, I found getting a healing item earlier on can be incredibly important because you just feel really weak until you have some form of health sustain, some form of survivability. Most items in the game are gotten through chests, which randomly give you an item, but there are a couple counter RNG measures there. Most notably, some item drops, some chests let you choose 1 out of 3 options, and you can use item machines across the map to randomly transform one of your items into whatever items in the machine. And that gives you some more control over your build. But while which items you get and when you get them matters a lot for how well you do, they don't really change your playstyle that much. This is partially because you have so many items that the impact of each one feels smaller, but also, just generally speaking, for most characters, you'll play very similar regardless of what items you get, because your character's loadout has a larger impact on the core gameplay mechanics than the items do. Some items do have rare or just fun effects, but they don't really change how you play the game. So I think the RNG for items falls a little flat in my opinion. It has a decent impact on your success, how well you do, but the items don't add a lot of meaningful gameplay variety. Randomness is also involved in which maps you get on a certain run, but there's less randomness within each map itself. The maps aren't procedurally generated, but each biome or area has a couple different variants. You can think of the maps as having a core area and a couple extra areas that may or may not be there on a given run, depending what map variant you get. Once you've played a couple runs on each map, you get used to each area pretty quickly, and you can navigate around it pretty well. I haven't gotten bored of any of these maps yet, so I do think there is enough variety there, and there are an okay number of different maps with 10 different types. Next, I'd like to talk about progression in roguelites, because that's one of the key components of their replayability. And there are two main forms: horizontal progression, which is progression that does not change the difficulty of the game, and vertical progression, which does change the difficulty of the game in some way, whether by making it easier or harder. As a whole, Risk of Rain 2 is a roguelite that focuses more on horizontal progression than vertical progression. The main form of horizontal progression is unlocking different characters or survivors, new survivor abilities and weapons, and new item drops. All of these unlocks require completing various challenges. Some of them, such as unlocking the first few survivors, are really easy, and it's something you'll unlock as you play through the game without any additional effort. Other challenges require you to do very specific things that'll almost definitely require you to look things up online in order to actually know what to do. It really feels like a wiki game at times, and by that I mean you feel like you need to play with the wiki open if you want to unlock certain things in a reasonable amount of time. There's a good amount of hidden content in the game, and you'll just miss a lot of it unless you actively seek it out, either through thoroughly exploring the game while playing or through looking things up online. On the other hand, vertical progression, which is progression that makes the game easier or harder in some way, is more sparse in Risk of Rain 2. There are different difficulty levels. There's easy, medium, and hard, but most other forms of vertical progression are more soft vertical progression that is mixed in with the horizontal progression. And by that I mean there are some items you unlock or some characters that are just better than others, but they're never buffs across run that just make you more powerful. So for example, there's no buff that just increases your health or damage for future runs, but you might unlock an item for future runs that's just better than most base items, so you've improved your item pool and made the game easier in a sense. Another example of this sort of mixed progression are artifacts, which are basically these run modifiers you can add and customize as you want to. They can do things that make the game strictly harder. So for example, spawning elite enemies only instead of regular enemies, or increasing your fall damage, but they can also just change up gameplay mechanics. So for example, the artifact of glass makes you deal way more damage, but you also have way less health. These are also unlocked through a lot of secret digging, and are something you'll probably just have to look up if you want to unlock all of them in a reasonable amount of time. Also, as I mentioned at the start of the video, you can loop the game instead of fighting the final boss. This means that you'll go back to the first stage and fight through more maps with new enemy types, and you can loop the game an infinite number of times. So if you like those types of games, you can just see how far you go. Risk of Rain has that too. As a whole, a lot of progression and replayability in Risk of Rain 2 comes from unlocking new characters, items, and abilities, all of which add gameplay variety, and some of which feel like indirect buffs by just being better than the normal alternatives. And while some of this unlocking can be done when naturally playing the game, a lot of it is locked behind exploring secrets or doing challenges in the game that usually require you to look something up. Now let's talk about the narrative and story in Risk of Rain 2. Risk of Rain 2 actually does have a good amount of lore to it, but there isn't really exactly a story. You could play 100 hours in the game and have no idea there's any lore at all, besides a cutscene at the beginning of the game and one when you beat the final boss. But there is a lore-filled logbook you can complete as you play the game, and it's also in the same universe as Risk of Rain 1, and it builds on that lore more. So if you want a game with lore to explore, Risk of Rain 2 has that, but it's not exactly a story-driven game. It never really got me invested into that lore as I played through it. So what's my verdict of Risk of Rain 2? Overall, it's a really fun third-person shooter roguelite with nice core gameplay that reminds me a little bit of zombie games. The gameplay itself feels nice and smooth and just fun. The characters also feel different from each other with their own unique playstyles, and multiplayer co-op brings more replayability to the game. However, there are some flaws that put it outside my favorite roguelites of all time. Notably, the insta-kill potential is a little annoying, and it has some weird action or difficulty spikes as you play through it. Sometimes you're just waiting around for enemies to spawn, and other times you're completely overwhelmed by the enemies around you. And while the items in the game are important for determining how well you do, you need to have good items if you want to do well, they become almost underwhelming at times because they don't often meaningfully change how you play, so much as impacting how well your attacks and abilities are working and your survivability. Finally, the game has a lot of its secrets to explore, and there's a lot of random things in the game to find. This can be really great if you want that type of game to explore, if you like finding those things, but since a lot of the unlocks in the game are tied behind these secrets, it can feel like a wiki game at times, or a game that you have to play with the wiki open in order to actually unlock these things because you just won't naturally find them. I paid $12 for Risk Rain 2, and I've absolutely got my money's worth. I think it's worth buying, even at full price actually. And it can be a great game for people who don't usually play roguelites because it's so accessible, the gameplay's so smooth. I'll keep playing it occasionally as one of my top multiplayer roguelites, but the flaws that I mentioned prevent it from being one of my favorite roguelites of all time. Please like this video to help me out if you found it enjoyable or informative, and I'll link some more roguelite reviews of mine in the description down below. Thanks for watching.